Don't sign that. It's already forged. A small voice cut through the polished silence of the Caldwell Industries executive boardroom like a blade through glass. For half a second, no one moved. The city of New York stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight reflecting off steel towers, while inside, every eye turned toward the source of the voice. At the center of the long mahogany table sat Ethan Caldwell, 42 years old, billionaire CEO, known for closing deals worth hundreds of millions with a single signature. His pen had been hovering just above the contract that would merge Caldwell Industries with Hale Dynamics, a $200 million agreement that had taken months of negotiation. Across from him sat Victor Hale, the company's chief financial officer, calm, composed, wearing a smile that looked perfectly practiced. But now, standing near the glass wall of the conference room, was a girl who did not belong in any of this. Ava Johnson, 8 years old, small frame, braided hair, holding a tablet almost as big as her torso. Security had already turned their heads toward her, unsure whether she had wandered in by mistake or had been brought in by someone on staff. Ethan slowly lowered his pen but did not speak. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. "Excuse me," Victor Hale said with a light chuckle, leaning back in his chair as if the interruption were an amusing glitch in an otherwise perfect presentation. "I think someone needs to escort the child out." A couple of executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, waiting for Ethan to react. Ava did not move. Her hands tightened around the tablet. Her voice, though small, remained steady. "The signature on that document is not yours," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "It was copied and reconstructed from previous contracts." A faint ripple of laughter moved through the room, quickly suppressed as everyone sensed Ethan's expression had changed. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't dismissing her either. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table. "And how exactly would you know that?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the kind of curiosity reserved for things that did not belong in his world, but somehow still managed to appear in it. Ava hesitated for the first time, glancing down at her tablet, then back up. "Because I studied your previous filings," she said. "All of them. Your signature isn't identical in any two contracts. It has micro-variations. But this one," she paused, swallowing. "This one is perfect. Too perfect." Silence settled again, heavier this time. Victor Hale gave a slow, controlled smile. "This is absurd," he said smoothly, turning slightly toward Ethan. "With all due respect, we're allowing a child to interpret corporate documents now." One of the board members gave a nervous laugh, but it faded quickly when Ethan raised a hand, signaling silence without saying a word. His gaze shifted back to Ava. Something in her certainty held him in place. He had spent decades reading people, reading rooms, reading risk. And something about the way she stood, unshaken, precise, almost painfully focused, did not feel like noise. It felt like signal. "Show me," Ethan said finally. The room tightened. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, subtle but noticeable. Ava stepped forward carefully, placing her tablet on the edge of the conference table. With a swipe, she brought up layered document analysis, highlighting signature overlays, digital timestamps, and metadata trails. Lines of comparison appeared, faint but undeniable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. One of the senior analysts leaned in, frowning. "That shouldn't be possible without internal access," he murmured. Ethan's eyes tracked every detail, his expression slowly shifting from curiosity to focus. The room no longer felt like a boardroom. It felt like a pressure chamber. Victor cleared his throat lightly. "Even if there are discrepancies," he said, voice calm but slightly tighter now, "this hardly proves fraud. It could be a system error, misfiled data, anything." Ava shook her head immediately. "It's not an error," she said. "Look at the layering sequence. The signature was placed after the document was compiled, not during. That means it was inserted." A quiet tension spread across the table. Ethan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as if recalibrating everything in front of him. Outside, a distant siren echoed faintly through the city, but inside the room, the silence was absolute. Victor's smile remained, but something behind it had begun to fracture. "Ethan," he said carefully now, turning toward him, "you're not seriously considering this based on—" "I didn't say I believed it," Ethan interrupted calmly. eyes still on the tablet. I said, show me everything. Ava looked up at him then, and for the first time, her shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she spoke. Ethan stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the polished floor. Cancel the signing, he said simply. No one moved for a second, as if the words had to travel twice through the room before they could be understood. Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Ethan, this is a $200 million deal, he said carefully. Ethan picked up the contract, not signing it, just turning it once in his hands. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ava, then back to the document. Then it can wait, he said. And in that moment, something in the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that everyone felt it. Because the deal had not just been paused. It had been suspended on the word of an 8-year-old girl who should not have been able to see what she saw. And Victor Hale, still smiling faintly, realized that for the first time since this entire plan had begun, Ethan Caldwell was no longer looking at the contract. He was looking at him. The silence in the conference room did not break immediately after Ethan Caldwell lowered the contract. It lingered, heavy and unresolved, like the air before a storm finally decides to move. Ava Johnson still stood near the edge of the table, her small hands resting against the tablet as if it were the only solid thing in the room. No one spoke for several seconds. Victor Hale was the first to shift, leaning back slightly in his chair with a controlled exhale, trying to reclaim the balance that had just tilted. Ethan, he said calmly, I understand the need to entertain new information, but we are talking about a child interpreting technical documents she cannot possibly be qualified to understand. His tone was measured, almost patient, but there was a thin edge beneath it now. Ethan did not respond immediately. His attention remained on the contract in his hand, but his focus was no longer on the paper itself. It was on the structure behind it, the timeline, the signatures, the sequence of approvals. Something about it no longer aligned the way it should have. She did not interpret anything. Ethan said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. She pointed out a pattern. Ava glanced up at him, surprised that he had defended her at all. Victor gave a small, almost dismissive smile. Patterns can be coincidence, he replied, especially when suggested by outside influence. That phrase lingered for a moment. Outside influence. Ava straightened slightly. I was not influenced, she said clearly. I just followed the document trail. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Ethan and Victor. The room had stopped feeling like a business meeting and started feeling like something else entirely, something closer to an interrogation where no one had agreed on the rules. Ethan walked slowly toward the projection screen at the front of the room. Pull the original version of the file, he said to the room, not to Victor specifically, but everyone understood who the instruction was aimed at. A technician hesitated, then began typing. Within seconds, the original contract appeared on the screen beside the modified version Ava had displayed. The difference was subtle at first glance, almost invisible, but Ava stepped forward and pointed. There, she said softly. That timestamp does not match the approval log. The technician leaned in closer. A few seconds passed. Then he frowned. She is correct, he said quietly. The room shifted again. Not dramatically, not loudly, but like a collective breath being held a little tighter. Victor's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he relaxed it again. Even if there is a discrepancy in the file metadata, he said, that does not indicate intent. It could be a system synchronization issue between servers. Ava shook her head. It is not a synchronization issue, she said. The signature layer is not part of the original encryption sequence. It was added after the audit lock. Ethan turned slightly toward her. You are certain of that? He asked. Ava nodded once. Yes, sir. There was no hesitation in her voice. That certainty settled differently in the room. Ethan looked back at the screen, then at the contract in his hand, then finally toward Victor Hale. Explain it, Ethan said. Victor gave a small laugh, but it lacked warmth. Explain what? A child's theory based on digital guessing, he replied. But even as he said it, his eyes flicked briefly toward the technician. Just once. That flicker did not go unnoticed. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. If there is nothing to hide, he said evenly, then there should be no problem explaining it. The room felt tighter now, as if the walls themselves had inched closer. Ava watched Victor carefully. She was not smiling, not accusing, Just observing, the way someone looks at something they are trying to understand before it disappears. Victor adjusted his cuff slightly. I will have my team review the file integrity, he said. But I assure you, this is a distraction from the actual deal. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the contract back on the table, face down. The sound of paper meeting would echoed slightly louder than it should have. We are not signing anything today, he said. Victor's expression tightened for the briefest moment before smoothing again. That would be a significant delay, he said carefully. For a $200 million agreement. Ethan met his gaze directly. Then it will wait, he repeated. A silence followed, heavier than before. Ava exhaled slowly, almost as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she spoke. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Where did you learn to read files like that? He asked. Ava hesitated. For the first time since entering the room, she looked unsure. I look at patterns, she said simply. Numbers do not lie when you know how to read them. Ethan studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone else in the room. Then he nodded once. Stay here, he said. Victor stepped forward slightly. Ethan, I strongly advise against involving outside civilians in corporate matters. Ethan did not look away from Ava when he replied. She is not outside this anymore. That sentence landed differently. Not as a decision, but as a shift. The technician at the console cleared his throat quietly. Sir, he said, there is something else. Ethan turned. Show me. The technician hesitated, then brought up another layer of data. A secondary access log. A name appeared on the screen. Ava did not react, but Ethan noticed Victor's posture change instantly. It was small, almost imperceptible, but real enough to register. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. The name was not supposed to be there. Not in that sequence. Not with that access level. The room did not speak. Even Victor remained silent now. And for the first time since the meeting began, Ethan Caldwell stopped looking at the contract entirely and started looking at the system that created it. The room did not recover from the silence that followed the appearance of the access log on the screen. The name displayed there seemed to hold more weight than the numbers surrounding it, as if it did not belong in the system at all. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the data stream, processing not just what was visible, but what it implied. Ava Johnson remained still near the table, her small figure contrasting sharply with the scale of the corporate environment around her. Victor Hale, however, had changed. The composure he had carefully maintained earlier was no longer as seamless. His hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers slightly tense, though his voice when he spoke again remained controlled. That is a back-end service account, Victor said. It is likely tied to system maintenance or temporary authorization protocols. Nothing unusual. Ethan did not immediately respond. He leaned slightly closer to the screen, eyes narrowing just enough to suggest he was no longer taking anything at face value. Then explain why it is. Linked to contract approval access, Ethan said. His voice was calm, but the room felt colder after he spoke. The technician at the console hesitated again. Sir, he said quietly, this account should not have write permissions on financial documents. That statement changed the atmosphere instantly. A few executives exchanged uncertain looks. Ava looked up at the screen again, her expression focused but not emotional, as if confirming something she already suspected rather than discovering it for the first time. Victor gave a small laugh, but it lacked any natural rhythm now. Systems fail, he said. Permissions get misassigned. We are dealing with complex infrastructure. Ethan turned toward him fully for the first time since the discussion began. And yet, Ethan said slowly, this particular misassignment happens to affect a $200 million agreement. The pause that followed was deliberate, not aggressive, but absolute. Victor's smile thinned. Ava stepped slightly closer to Ethan, her voice soft but steady. It was not random, she said. The same account accessed 3 previous drafts before the final version was uploaded. Ethan glanced at her. You tracked that? Ava nodded. It leaves a pattern, even when it tries not to. The technician zoomed in further on the log. Multiple entries now appeared, all tied to the same hidden access point. Each modification occurred within short intervals of each other, clustered tightly in time, almost as if someone had been careful but not careful enough. The room felt like it was leaning forward without anyone moving. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Freeze all document activity on this file, he said. The technician immediately complied. Victor shifted slightly in his seat. Ethan, this is escalating unnecessarily, he said. We are minutes away from finalization. Any delay now will trigger market uncertainty. Ethan did not look at him. His eyes remained on the screen. Market uncertainty is not my concern right now, he said. Ava looked up at him briefly, as if registering that sentence carefully. Then Ethan continued. My concern is how a system I built can be altered without authorization. That statement carried a different weight than anything said earlier. It was not accusation. It was realization. A board member cleared his throat nervously. Should we proceed with internal audit protocols? He asked. Ethan nodded once. Immediately. Victor leaned forward slightly now. You are making a mistake, he said, his voice lower. If this becomes public without verification, it could damage every partner involved, including your own company. For the first time, Ethan looked directly at him without hesitation. If it is false, verification will prove it, he said. If it is not, then hiding it would do far more damage. Ava stood very still, watching the exchange closely. There was no fear in her expression, only attention, as if she were observing a structure begin to reveal its weakest point. The technician at the console suddenly spoke again. Sir, he said, there is a secondary authentication override embedded in the file. Ethan turned sharply. Explain. The technician swallowed. It is disguised within the approval sequence. It mimics standard validation, but it bypasses signature origin verification. A brief silence followed that explanation. Even Victor did not respond immediately. Ethan stepped closer to the screen, studying the lines of code and metadata now highlighted. Who had access to implement this? Ethan asked. The technician shook his head. Only 3 accounts have that level of clearance. Ethan turned slowly back toward the room. The implication was now unavoidable. Victor stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively, but deliberately, as if reclaiming physical presence would restore control. This is becoming speculative, he said. We are interpreting technical anomalies as intent, which is not a valid conclusion. Ava looked at Victor then, her voice quiet but precise. Intent leaves patterns, she said again, even when people try to hide it. That sentence seemed to land differently than before. Victor did not respond immediately. Instead, his eyes shifted briefly toward Ethan, searching for reaction. But Ethan was no longer reacting to words. He was reading the system like a map that had been altered after it was printed. Finally, Ethan spoke. Lock every account associated with this file, he said. No further changes until full forensic review is complete. The technician nodded quickly and began executing the command. Victor's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before settling again. Ethan, he said carefully, you are freezing a live merger over a hypothesis from a child. Ethan's answer was immediate, but calm. No, he said. I'm freezing it over evidence that someone believed I would not look closely enough. The room fell into another silence, deeper than before. Ava looked up at Ethan again. For the first time, there was something like confirmation in her expression, not that she had been right, but that someone had finally chosen to see what she saw. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the city continued moving as if nothing had changed. Inside, however, every assumption had begun to shift, and Ethan Caldwell was no longer treating the situation as a negotiation. He was treating it as a breach. The instruction to freeze all account activity had already been executed, and the room now felt different in a way that could not be reversed simply by conversation. The boardroom at Caldwell Industries was no longer functioning as a place of decision-making, but as a controlled investigation space. Ethan Caldwell stood near the central display, watching the system logs update in real time as security protocols engaged across the network. Ava Johnson remained close to the table, quiet but attentive, her presence still unexpected in a room filled with executives who were now far less certain about the situation than they had been minutes earlier. Victor Hale stood slightly apart from the group, no longer leaning into confidence, but maintaining a rigid posture that suggested calculation rather than comfort. The technician at the console spoke again after a brief pause, his voice careful. Sir, all active permissions tied to the document have been suspended. No further modifications are possible without executive override. Ethan nodded once, not taking his eyes off the screen. Good, he said simply. Ava looked up at him, then back at the data stream. They will. Try to reroute access, she said quietly. It was not a question. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Who is they, he asked. Ava hesitated for a moment, then pointed at the cluster of access logs still visible on the screen. Whoever is controlling that account is not finished, she said. The pattern shows repeated attempts before. They stop when they think they are being watched. Victor gave a soft exhale, almost like a dismissive correction. There is no one controlling anything, he said. This is a technical misinterpretation of routine background processes. Ethan turned toward him slowly. Routine processes do not alter financial signatures, he said. The room grew still again. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another glanced toward the glass wall, as if expecting someone from outside to interrupt and restore normalcy. But nothing returned to normal. Ethan stepped closer to the console. Trace the origin of the override sequence, he said. The technician hesitated. It is partially masked, he replied. But we are isolating a geographic cluster. Ava moved closer to the screen without touching it. It is routed through multiple internal proxies, she said. But the initial trigger comes from inside the building. That sentence changed the tone of the room instantly. A low murmur spread among the executives. Ethan did not react outwardly, but his eyes sharpened. Inside the building, he repeated. Victor finally spoke again, his tone controlled but noticeably tighter. That is a broad interpretation of network routing behavior, he said. Internal IP addresses can be misassigned or temporarily mirrored. Ava shook her head slightly. This is not temporary, she said. It has been active across 3 separate document cycles. Ethan looked between the screen and the room itself now, as if reassessing not just data but people. Show me the personnel access list for those cycles, he said. The technician complied immediately. A list appeared. Names, roles, access levels. As the list populated, Ava's gaze narrowed slightly. She was tracking something that others had not yet noticed. Then she raised her hand slightly, pointing at one of the entries. That one, she said softly. Ethan followed her gesture. The name belonged to a senior internal systems coordinator, someone responsible for document validation pipelines. Victor shifted his stance subtly. Not enough for most to notice, but enough for Ethan to register. That employee is not involved in contract authorization, Victor said quickly. Their access is limited to maintenance layers. Ethan looked at him directly. Then explain why their credentials appear in the approval chain, he said. Victor paused just long enough for the pause itself to become meaningful. I will need to verify that, he said carefully. Ava took a small step forward. They are not acting alone, she said. There are multiple access overlaps. It is structured, not accidental. Ethan studied the screen again, then spoke without raising his voice. Isolate every transaction involving that account. The technician began typing immediately. Lines of interaction began to separate, forming a clearer pattern of activity across multiple files. What had once looked like noise was now forming structure. A structure that pointed inward. Victor finally stepped closer to the table again. Ethan, he said, voice lowering slightly. You are allowing an unverified interpretation to disrupt a major acquisition process. If this becomes known publicly, the damage will extend far beyond this room. Ethan turned toward him slowly. If this is real, it already is beyond this room, he said. Ava looked between them quietly, then added, It is not about interpretation anymore. It is about tracing who benefits from the change. That sentence landed heavier than the others. Ethan exhaled slowly, then nodded once. Then we trace it all the way, he said. The technician hesitated. Sir, that will expose internal routing history across the entire financial division. Ethan did not hesitate. Do it. The screen began to shift again, layers of access logs unfolding further back in time. The room remained silent, but the tension was no longer about uncertainty. It was about proximity. The system was now revealing patterns that no one in the room could ignore. Ava stood still, watching. Carefully, her expression focused but calm. Victor no longer spoke. He simply watched the unfolding data with a stillness that no longer resembled confidence. And as Ethan Caldwell watched the network map expand across the screen, he realized the issue was no longer whether the signature had been forged. The issue was how deeply the structure of his own company had been touched without anyone noticing until now. The expansion of the internal access network on the screen did not slow down. Instead, it became more detailed. as if the system itself was reluctantly revealing layers that had been hidden beneath routine operations. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless at the center of the boardroom, his eyes fixed on the evolving map of transactions and access routes spreading across the digital display. Ava Johnson remained near the edge of the table, quietly observing every shift in the data with an intensity that did not belong to her age. The room behind them was no longer just a meeting space. It had become a controlled observation field where every executive was now aware that what they thought was a simple contract review had transformed into something far more serious. Victor Hale had not spoken for several minutes. His stillness was no longer composed in the way it had been earlier. It was controlled in a different sense now, as if every movement was being calculated rather than expressed. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Expand the trace to financial authorization notes," he said. The technician hesitated briefly before executing the command. The system responded almost immediately. New layers of linked approvals appeared, branching across departments that should not have been interacting with this contract at this stage. Ava leaned slightly forward. "They are not just changing signatures," she said softly. "They are adjusting approval timing to make it appear sequential." Ethan turned his head slightly toward her. "Explain." Ava pointed at the screen. "Each entry is delayed by exactly the same interval. It is designed to mimic normal workflow delays, but it is too consistent. Real approvals are never that precise." One of the senior analysts behind them murmured quietly, "That would require predictive access to workflow behavior." Victor finally stepped forward again. "Or," he said, carefully, "it is a coincidence created by automated system batching." Ava shook her head slightly. "It repeats across different departments," she said. "Automation does not coordinate across isolated divisions like this unless someone configured it." Ethan studied the screen for a long moment. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was structured repetition across systems that were supposed to be independent. "Show me the origin point," he said. The technician adjusted the display again. The map contracted, narrowing down through multiple layers of routing paths until a central node appeared. A single internal access point inside Caldwell Industries headquarters. A low murmur spread through the room. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but his attention had fully locked onto the origin point. "That access node belongs to internal infrastructure," he said. The technician nodded. "Yes, sir. It is part of administrative routing." Ava looked at the screen closely. "But it is being used outside its assigned purpose," she said. Victor exhaled slowly. "This is becoming speculative interpretation of network behavior," he said again, but his tone lacked the firmness it had carried earlier. Ethan turned toward him. "We are past interpretation," he said. "We are looking at a live system altering financial authorization pathways." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "And you are basing that conclusion on incomplete forensic data in real time," he replied. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked back at Ava. "Can this be traced further?" he asked. Ava hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Yes," she said, "but it will require opening restricted system archives." Ethan looked toward the technician. "Do it." The technician paused. "Sir, that level of access will trigger internal audit alerts across all executive accounts." Ethan did not hesitate. "Proceed." The system responded with a deeper scan. For a moment, the screen flickered as if resisting the request. Then new data streams opened. A secondary layer of administrative activity appeared, hidden beneath standard logs. Ava's expression changed slightly, not with surprise, but with recognition. "There," she said quietly. Ethan stepped closer. The screen now showed overlapping access signatures tied to the same internal node, but with multiple masked identities embedded within it. Victor moved closer as well, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the display. "This is not standard configuration," he said. Ava shook her head. "It is not supposed to exist in the system at all," she said. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "Then how long has it been active?" The technician scanned the metadata timestamps. "Approximately 6 months," he said. The room shifted again. 6 months of undetected structural access within financial authorization systems. Ethan slowly exhaled, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Who authorized the initial deployment of this node?" he asked. The technician hesitated. "The records indicate executive-level approval," he said. Ava looked up immediately. "Which executive?" she asked. The technician hesitated again, then displayed the authorization chain. A name appeared on the screen. The room did not react immediately. It took a moment for the implication to settle. Ethan stared at the name without speaking. Victor did not move, but his posture had changed completely now. Ava looked between the screen and Ethan, her expression calm but focused. "That is the entry point," she said softly. Ethan finally spoke. "Lock that account," he said. The technician responded immediately. "It is already locked, sir. The system is isolating it as we speak." A moment of silence followed. Not empty silence, but contained silence, as if the room itself was waiting for the next shift in reality. Ethan looked at the screen one more time, then turned slightly toward Ava. "You were right," he said simply. Ava did not respond immediately. She only nodded once. Victor finally spoke, his voice lower now. "Ethan, this does not prove intent," he said. Ethan turned toward him. "It proves access," he replied. "And access is enough to stop everything until we understand what it was used for." The technician looked up from the console. "Sir, the system has completed the trace," he said. Ethan stepped forward again. "Show it." The final layer unfolded. A complete map of internal financial routing interference across multiple contract cycles. Ethan studied it in silence. Ava stood beside him, watching the same data. And for the first time since this began, the realization was no longer about one contract, one signature, or one deal. It was about the structure that had allowed it to happen repeatedly without resistance. The final system map remained projected across the boardroom display, a complex web of financial routing paths, authorization layers, and internal access points that now revealed a pattern too consistent to be ignored. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it, his eyes scanning every line of data as if the structure of his entire company had just shifted beneath him. Ava Johnson remained slightly behind him, close enough to observe, but still maintaining a quiet distance, her attention fixed on the same digital architecture that had begun to expose itself layer by layer. The room itself felt different now, no longer functioning as a space for decision-making, but as a containment zone for unfolding truth. Victor Hale stood near the table, no longer speaking, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that was difficult to interpret. The technician at the console cleared his throat softly before speaking. "Sir," he said, "the system has completed full trace integration. We now have a complete reconstruction of the interference timeline." Ethan did not look away from the screen. "Display it," he said. The map shifted again, collapsing into a chronological sequence of events. Each layer represented a moment where contract data had been accessed, modified, or rerouted through internal authorization nodes. Ava stepped slightly closer. "That sequence," she said quietly, pointing at a cluster of entries, "is where the signature alteration began." Ethan leaned in. The timestamps were precise, down to seconds. The modifications were not random. They followed a structured rhythm that suggested deliberate coordination rather than opportunistic access. Victor finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. "Even if this sequence is accurate, it still does not establish responsibility," he said. Ava looked at him briefly. "It shows direction," she replied. "And direction always leads somewhere." Ethan turned slightly toward Victor. "Where does it lead?" he asked. The technician hesitated before responding. "All routes converge toward a single administrative oversight channel," he said. The room went silent again. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. The convergence point was highlighted in red, indicating a central control node within the company's internal authorization framework. "That node should only be accessible by executive security clearance," Ethan said. The technician nodded. "Yes, sir." Ava studied the convergence point carefully. "But it has been accessed repeatedly," she said. "Not just once. Not by accident." Victor shifted slightly. "Access logs can be spoofed," he said. "If someone has sufficient knowledge of the system architecture, they can simulate routing behavior." Ethan turned toward him fully now. "So you are saying someone inside this company has the knowledge and access to simulate executive-level authorization without detection," he said. Victor paused, just long enough for the statement to hang in the air without correction. That pause was enough. Ava noticed it too. She did not speak immediately, but her gaze shifted between Victor and the screen. Ethan returned his attention to the data. "Show me all accounts that interacted with the convergence node," he said. The technician executed the command. A list populated instantly. Multiple internal accounts appeared, most of them administrative, some operational, and one marked with higher clearance classification. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. That account, he said, pointing. The technician highlighted it. Victor Hale's name appeared in the extended access history. The room did not react immediately. It took a moment for the implication to settle. Ethan did not speak right away. He simply stared at the screen. Ava looked at the data, then at Victor, then back at Ethan, her expression calm but alert. Victor exhaled slowly. "This is expected," he said. "As Chief Financial Officer, I have oversight access to financial validation systems. That does not imply interference." Ethan turned toward him slowly. "It shows access during every modification cycle," he said. Victor responded immediately, "Which is standard oversight protocol." Ava stepped forward slightly. "Oversight does not require repeated entry into signature modification layers," she said quietly. Victor looked at her for the first time with visible irritation. "You are interpreting corporate structure without context," he said. Ava did not step back. "I am reading what the system recorded," she replied. Ethan raised one hand slightly, signaling silence without needing to raise his voice. The room obeyed instantly. He turned back to the screen. The data was no longer abstract. It was sequential behavior tied to real-time decisions, real approvals, and real interference. "Run a cross-verification against external audit logs," Ethan said. The technician hesitated. "Sir, that will expose synchronization with outside financial regulators." Ethan nodded. "Proceed." The system processed for several seconds. Then new entries appeared. External synchronization points showed slight discrepancies in reporting alignment. Ava leaned in again. "That inconsistency is not from outside," she said. "It originates from internal delay insertion." Ethan studied the pattern. "Explain," he said. Ava pointed at the sequence. "Reports were intentionally delayed before external submission. That creates the appearance of normal timing. But the internal approval is already altered." Victor spoke again, his tone now sharper. "This level of inference is speculative," he said. Ethan turned toward him. "It is not inference anymore," he said. "It is documented behavior." The room felt tighter again, the air heavier with each new layer of data revealed. The technician hesitated before speaking again. "Sir," he said, "there is one more anomaly." Ethan looked at him immediately. "Show it." The display shifted one final time. A hidden access pathway appeared, previously masked within system maintenance protocols. It showed repeated activation across multiple contract cycles, always preceding financial approval changes by minutes or seconds. Ava's expression changed slightly. Not shock, but recognition. "That is the entry sequence," she said softly. Ethan stepped closer. "Entry to what?" he asked. The technician answered quietly. "To override execution timing for contract validation." The implications settled across the room like a weight that could no longer be avoided. Ethan slowly turned toward Victor. For the first time, Victor did not speak immediately. The silence stretched. And in that silence, Ethan Caldwell realized that what he was looking at was no longer just a compromised contract. It was a controlled internal system that had been operating beneath his company's surface long before anyone had noticed. And now every path on the screen was pointing back toward a level of access that should never have been misused at all. The silence inside the boardroom had changed again, but this time it was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of recognition. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless at the center of the projection screen, his eyes locked on the hidden access sequence that had just been fully revealed. Every line of data now pointed toward a structured pattern of control that had operated beneath multiple contract cycles without interruption. Ava Johnson remained slightly behind him, her presence steady but focused, as if she had already moved past discovery and was now observing consequence. The technician at the console waited for instruction, hands hovering above the keyboard, uncertain whether to proceed further or stop entirely. Victor Hale had not spoken since the last system trace appeared. His posture remained upright, but the stillness around him had shifted from controlled confidence to contained tension. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Run a full dependency map on the override sequence," he said. The technician hesitated for a fraction of a second before executing the command. The screen responded immediately, unfolding a layered visualization of interconnected systems. What appeared next was not a simple chain of access logs, but a full structural dependency network showing how authorization, approval timing, and contract validation were all linked through a hidden framework embedded within internal systems. Ava stepped closer again. This is not just one access point, she said quietly. It is a network of coordinated layers. Ethan studied the display carefully. Explain, he said. Ava pointed at the branching structure. Each node feeds into the next validation stage. If one is altered, the rest adjust to match it. That is why no one noticed it earlier. One of the senior analysts in the room leaned forward. That means the system was designed to self-correct inconsistencies, he said. Ava nodded slightly. Or to hide them. That sentence settled heavily across the room. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but his focus sharpened further. He turned slightly toward Victor. How long has this architecture been in place? He asked. Victor responded slowly. System upgrades over time evolve, he said. No single person designs every layer. Ava looked at him directly. But someone decides how layers connect, she said. Victor did not respond immediately. The technician spoke again from the console. Sir, the dependency map shows repeated structural alignment with financial approval delays dating back several reporting cycles. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. How many cycles? He asked. At least 6, the technician replied. The room grew still again. 6 cycles meant months of repeated interference without detection. Ethan stepped closer to the screen. Show me the first point of deviation, he said. The technician navigated backward through the system timeline. The display rewound, layers collapsing until a single initial activation point appeared. Ava leaned in slightly. That is where it started, she said softly. Ethan looked at the point carefully. It was subtle, almost invisible without the full reconstruction. A minor adjustment in validation timing. A small shift that would have seemed insignificant at the time. But it had propagated forward, shaping every subsequent approval layer. Victor finally spoke again, his voice lower. Even if there was an initial configuration error, it does not imply intent, he said. Ethan turned toward him slowly. It implies control, he replied. The technician hesitated. Sir, there is something else, he said. Ethan looked back immediately. Show it. A secondary overlay appeared on the screen. This one mapped user activity patterns during the initial deviation period. The data showed repeated administrative access to the same configuration layer from a single privileged account. Ava watched closely, her expression unchanged but intent. That access pattern does not match standard workflow behavior, she said. Victor shifted slightly. Usage patterns vary under operational load, he said. Ava shook her head. Not like this, she replied. Ethan stepped closer to the screen again. The account linked to the access pattern appeared. The room did not react immediately, but the atmosphere shifted in a way that was no longer subtle. Ethan read the entry carefully. The access frequency, the timing, the repeated engagement with sensitive configuration layers all aligned into a pattern that was no longer open to interpretation. He slowly turned toward Victor. Explain this, Ethan said. Victor paused. Just long enough for the pause to carry meaning. That account has executive oversight permissions, he said carefully. Ethan responded immediately. Oversight does not require repeated system modification at the configuration level. The technician added quietly. Sir, the account has been active during every deviation cycle. Silence returned again, but it was no longer passive. It was structured. Ava stepped slightly forward. That means the system changes were not passive, she said. They were guided. Victor's expression tightened slightly. This is being misrepresented, he said. Ethan did not raise his voice. No, he said calmly. It is being revealed. The technician spoke again. Sir, the system has completed full behavioral correlation analysis. Ethan turned toward the console. Display it. The screen updated one final time. A complete behavioral map appeared, linking access activity, approval changes, and timing adjustments into a single coordinated structure. Ethan studied it without moving. Ava stood beside him, her gaze steady, and Victor remained silent. For the first time since the beginning of the investigation, there was no longer uncertainty in the data, only alignment. And every line on the screen now converged toward a single conclusion that no one in the room could ignore. The behavioral correlation map remained projected across the boardroom display, but now it no longer felt like a technical visualization. It felt like exposure. Every line, every node, and every connection across Caldwell Industries' internal authorization system had converged into a single structured pattern that repeated across multiple contract cycles. Ethan Caldwell stood still in front of it, his expression controlled but deeply focused, as if he was no longer looking at a system but at the history of actions taken inside it. Ava Johnson remained slightly to his right, quiet and observant, her attention fixed on the same convergence points that had now become impossible to dismiss. The technician at the console waited silently for further instruction, while the rest of the boardroom had fallen into a tense stillness that no one was attempting to break. Victor Hale finally moved, taking a slow step forward. His voice, when it came, was calm but noticeably restrained. "Ethan," he said, "what you are looking at is a system optimization artifact. Complex networks often create patterns that appear intentional when they are not." Ethan did not turn immediately. His eyes remained on the screen. "This is not appearance," he said. "This is repetition." Ava stepped closer to the display. "The system is not generating randomness," she said quietly. "It is repeating structured behavior across identical conditions." Victor exhaled slowly. "Structured behavior does not imply manipulation," he said. Ethan turned toward him for the first time in several seconds. "When it repeats across 6 financial cycles," he said, "it stops being behavior and becomes design." The room tightened again. One of the senior analysts shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while another avoided direct eye contact with the screen. The technician spoke carefully. "Sir, the correlation analysis is complete. All interference points trace back to a unified control layer within internal authorization governance." Ethan nodded once. "Identify the control layer." The technician entered a final command. The display shifted, collapsing all branching systems into a single structural core. A central node appeared, highlighted in a muted red tone, labeled as Administrative Governance Override. Ava studied it closely. "That is not a standard operational layer," she said. "That is a supervisory control structure." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Explain what it supervises." Ava answered without hesitation. "It supervises approval integrity across financial contracts." A brief silence followed. Victor finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It was less assertive now, more carefully measured. "That layer exists for emergency correction protocols," he said. "It is not designed for daily intervention." Ethan looked at him directly. "And yet it has been active during every contract modification cycle we reviewed," he said. The technician confirmed quietly. "Yes, sir. The logs indicate repeated activation during standard approval processes." Ava stepped slightly forward again. "Which means it is not emergency usage," she said. "It is continuous governance interference." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "You are interpreting system safeguards as interference," he said. Ethan responded immediately. "We are observing system behavior over time," he said. "Interpretation is no longer required when the pattern is consistent." The room fell into another silence. The display on the screen now showed a complete map of governance access activity, layered over financial contract cycles, each overlap forming a precise and deliberate structure of influence. Ethan studied it carefully, then spoke. "Isolate every instance of supervisory override activation," he said. The technician complied. The system filtered the data again. Ava watched closely, then pointed at a recurring cluster. "That timing pattern matches contract review windows," she said. Ethan nodded slightly. "Which means intervention occurs during critical decision points," he said. Victor responded quickly. "Or during scheduled system audits," he said. Ava shook her head. "Audits do not align this precisely with contract signatures," she said. Ethan turned slightly toward Victor. "Explain the alignment," he said. Victor hesitated. The pause lasted long enough to become noticeable. "It is a coincidence of system scheduling," he said finally. Ethan looked back at the screen. "Coincidence does not repeat across 6 cycles with identical timing," he said. The technician spoke again. "Sir, there is one more layer of correlation." Ethan turned immediately. "Show it." The screen shifted again. A final overlay appeared, linking supervisory activation events to approval finalization delays. Every delay matched a preceding access pattern, forming a closed loop of influence that repeated across all observed contract cycles. Ava looked at it carefully. "This is a closed feedback system," she said softly. Ethan studied the pattern without speaking. Victor finally stepped forward again, but now there was a visible tension in his posture. "Ethan," he said, "you are allowing a child's interpretation of data anomalies to override structured corporate governance systems." Ethan turned toward him slowly. "No," he said. "I am allowing the system to speak for itself." The technician cleared his throat. "Sir, the analysis confirms that supervisory override is not isolated," he said. "It is embedded within operational continuity." Ethan nodded once. "Meaning it is part of the workflow," he said. Ava responded quietly. "Meaning it controls the workflow." A silence followed that statement. It was no longer a silence of confusion or uncertainty. It was a silence of recognition. Ethan looked at the full system map one more time. Every path, every node, every activation cycle now converged into a single unavoidable structure of influence that had been operating inside his company without interruption. And for the first time since the investigation began, the question was no longer where the interference came from, but how deeply it had already shaped every decision made within it. The boardroom had reached a point where silence was no longer passive. It was active, structured, and heavy with implication. The full governance interference map still remained projected across the central display, but now every executive in the room was studying it with the same uncomfortable realization that what they were observing was not a single system error, but a sustained internal structure embedded deep within Caldwell Industries. Ethan Caldwell stood at the front of the room, motionless for a moment, his gaze fixed on the convergence of supervisory override cycles and financial approval sequences. Ava Johnson remained close to his right side, her small figure steady, her attention still locked on the patterns that had now been fully exposed. The technician at the console waited silently, hands resting above the keyboard, ready but uncertain. Victor Hale stood slightly apart from the group, his expression now carefully controlled in a way that no longer matched confidence, but instead matched containment. Ethan finally spoke. "Collapse the entire timeline into a single executive overview," he said. The technician hesitated briefly, then executed the command. The display shifted again, compressing months of system activity into a single unified sequence. What appeared now was not just a set of logs, but a continuous chain of influence showing how supervisory overrides aligned with every major financial decision point. Ava studied the visualization carefully. "It is consistent across every cycle," she said quietly. "There are no gaps where the system is not being influenced." Ethan nodded once, his expression unchanged but more focused than before. "Which means the structure is always active," he said. Victor finally responded. "That is a misinterpretation," he said. "Continuous logging does not equal continuous interference. You are treating system visibility as system control." Ava turned slightly toward him. "Then explain why control points always activate before approval finalization," she said. Victor paused briefly. "Pre-approval alignment is part of workflow optimization," he said. Ethan turned toward him fully now. "Workflow optimization does not rewrite signatures," he said. The room shifted again. One of the senior executives leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the screen. Another remained still, as if movement itself might alter what was being revealed. The technician spoke again. "Sir, the system has completed full structural dependency resolution," he said. Ethan nodded. "Display the root governance origin." The screen responded immediately. The entire structure collapsed inward once more, layers of authorization and override sequences folding into a single central origin point. Ava stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but lower now. "That is where all control pathways converge," she said. Ethan studied the point carefully. "Identify the account associated with it," he said. The technician hesitated. "Sir, the origin node is linked to executive-level governance clearance," he said. A brief pause followed. Then the name appeared on the screen. The room did not react immediately. It took a moment for the weight of the identification to settle across every person present. Victor Hale did not move. Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the display. Ava looked at the name, then at Ethan, then back at the screen. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence in the room had changed again, no longer investigative, no longer uncertain, but fully aware. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Explain your access to this node," he said. Victor exhaled slowly. I have already explained that executive governance systems include supervisory permissions, he said. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the technician. Confirm all access activity associated with that node, he said. The technician complied instantly. The screen updated again, listing every interaction tied to the governance origin point. Multiple entries appeared across different contract cycles, all tied to the same supervisory structure that had been uncovered layer by layer. Ava observed the pattern carefully. The frequency is not administrative, she said quietly. It is operational. Ethan turned slightly toward Victor. This is no longer about interpretation, he said. Victor's expression remained controlled, but there was now a visible tension beneath it. You are escalating this beyond its actual scope, he said. Ethan responded immediately. The scope is defined by system behavior, he said, not explanation. The technician spoke again. Sir, the governance origin node has initiated a final audit lock across all historical contract data. Ethan turned sharply. What does that mean? The technician answered carefully. It means no further modifications can occur. The system is now preserving all records in their current state. Ava looked at the screen. It is sealing itself, she said quietly. Ethan nodded slightly. It is protecting its own structure, he said. Victor finally spoke again, but his tone had changed. It was no longer defensive in the same way. It was measured, but tighter. Ethan, he said, you are interpreting system safeguards as evidence of wrongdoing without acknowledging operational necessity. Ethan turned toward him slowly. Operational necessity does not conceal modification history, he said. The room remained silent again. The technician cleared his throat. Sir, the audit lock has completed, he said. All data is now permanently recorded for review. Ethan looked at the full system map one more time. Every layer, every override, every adjustment now existed in a locked state, fully preserved and fully visible. Ava stood beside him, still watching the convergence point. And Victor Hale remained silent, standing in the same position, while the system Ethan Caldwell had trusted for years now existed in front of him as a complete structural record of influence that had been operating beneath every decision, every approval, and every signature the company had made.